Okay, so in part B, we ended up talking a little bit about anti-competitive behavior. I'm not going to recap this in part C. If you want to learn more about Mattel, MGA, and Bratstall's, I would refer you to part B of lecture 12. We were about to talk about a single price monopolist and a monopolist that can engage in price discrimination. So let's look at what a single price monopolist, according to our graphs, would look like. So a single price monopolist would be a monopolist that charges everybody the same price. Imagine that would be PM. Why do we get PM? Because remember, the monopolist output decision is based on where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's how we get the quantity. We go up to the demand curve and then over to the price axis. So PM is the price at a quantity of QM. Well, what would the monopolist total revenue be? Well, it would simply be PM times QM over here. So this entire box that says total revenue would be the total revenue of a single price monopolist. But a monopolist might be able to charge people different prices. Now, there are whenever we hear the term price discrimination, we immediately think that that can't be good. We're going to look at price discrimination that is actually beneficial to at least some consumers. So there's two types of price discrimination. One is price discrimination that is detrimental to consumers because it forces at least some of these people to pay a higher price than they would if everybody was charged the same price. So let's think of an example that we might be familiar with. If you travel on an airplane, you know that very few people pay the same price. You have all these people, maybe 150, 200 people on a plane or more, and probably no two people pay the exact same fare. Now, which people tend to pay more to travel? The people who book at the last minute or the people who plan their vacations months and months in advance? And it turns out that the people who book at the last minute tend to be people who are going to pay more. And those people tend to be business travelers. Not always. I mean, you might have to travel on an emergency. You might be forced to book at the last minute and you'll pay more. But in general, pleasure travelers have the benefit of thinking months in advance and buying a ticket when the price is right. So they're going to get a cheaper fare than they would have if everybody had to pay the same price. And business travelers or people who are forced to book at the last minute are going to pay a higher fare than they would if they could have put a little bit of planning into it. All right, so what are the conditions to a monopolist practicing price discrimination? So we've got several. One is that the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, and in general, that's what we agree. That's what we think is going to happen. So we can check this one off. The monopolist can identify consumers willing to pay different prices. So let's stick for a minute with the air travel example. So how does an airline identify people who are willing to pay different prices? In other words, how would an airline identify a business traveler from a pleasure traveler? It could be the day of the week that they travel on or the day of the week that they have to return on. So for example, if you're traveling on business for your company, you're probably going to get your company to fly you back on a Friday. Why is that? Because you want to spend time with your family, right? So one of the things that the airline looks at is, okay, when is this guy coming back? If they're willing to spend a weekend at their location, then maybe they're a pleasure traveler and maybe they're going to be more price sensitive. On the other hand, if they have to come back on a Thursday, a Wednesday, Thursday, or a Friday, then they're more likely to be a business traveler and maybe we can charge them more money. Another condition for price discrimination is that trade between the two groups cannot occur. There's not what we call arbitrage possibility. So arbitrage is a term that means buying low in one market and reselling at a higher price in another market. So for example, if there was a way, and nowadays everything's online, but if there was a way for pleasure travelers, let's say, to book a flight and then go on to some website or use some app to sell to business travelers at a higher price, that would be an arbitrage possibility. So one of the things the airlines have done actually to negate this is that they passed a law. This is even before the internet came out and before 9/11. This is back in the 1990s, that said that the name on your ticket had to match the name on a driver's license. Why is that? Because they wanted to make sure that when somebody presented a ticket at the counter, that that was actually the person who bought that ticket, or whose name was on the ticket. And the real reason they did that was because they didn't want people in different groups to be able to resell tickets that they didn't need. So if the monopolist is able to practice what we call perfect price discrimination, they'll be able to convert the demand curve into the marginal revenue curve. So let's take a look at an example over here. Imagine that you have monopolists with identical cost structures. And let's imagine that their cost structure is such that the marginal cost is equal to the average total cost. So let's imagine that we're talking about, let's say, the airline industry. It's true that the airplanes themselves are very, very large outlays of money. But if you think about how long they fly, and you think about, how much time an airline owns an airplane, and then how much they use it, the cost of that airplane essentially goes to zero if you own it and use it long enough, especially since you can resell it once you're done to somebody else who needs an airline, maybe in another country or something like that. So let's say we have a marginal cost curve that is equal to the average total cost curve, and it's a horizontal line. We've got our downward sloping demand curve, and we've got a separate downward sloping marginal revenue curve as a result. If we're talking about a single price monopolist that charges everybody PM over here, then what would happen would be the monopolist would make everything above the average total cost and below PM times the quantity, which we're calling QM over here. And there'd be some consumer surplus, this triangle over here, left over for all those people who are buying, who are paying PM. Well, what if the monopolist could identify different people who are willing to pay different prices, and then they charge these people the highest price that they're able to get away with? Well, one thing they would be able to do is they'd be able to capture all this consumer surplus over here. They'd be able to convert that into profit for them, and then they would be able to get everything above the average total cost curve and below the demand curve. That would be more profit for them. So why is this actually beneficial to the flying public, let's say? Well, if you have a single price monopolist, they would provide QM over here. What we're saying is that the efficient quantity, the quantity that would get most people, let's say, to use this service, would be this one over here, Q efficient. Well, QM is below Q efficient. So we're actually, there is a deadweight loss with respect to a single price monopolist over here. And that means that society is not getting the full benefit of the service that this monopolist is providing. So if we compare QM to Q efficient, we see that QM is less than Q efficient. And so that means that society is not getting the benefit, which is something that I mentioned a little while ago. Is this monopolist making more profit? Yes, he is. How is he making more profit? He's making more profit because he's charging each individual passenger the maximum amount that they'd be willing to pay. He's taking away any consumer surplus from the passenger. But does that mean that the passenger is suffering? And the answer is no, because these prices along the demand curve all represent prices that individual passengers would be willing to pay. So they're not being forced to pay a price higher than they'd be willing to pay, because if they were, they just simply wouldn't buy it. So again, the monopolist makes more profit. They're able also to convert, if they practice price discrimination, they're able to convert the marginal revenue curve, which we have over here in the case of a single price monopolist, into they're able to convert their demand curve into the marginal revenue curve. So each additional seat that they sell not only satisfies the demand, but it provides them with different amounts of marginal revenue so that they get to the point where the marginal cost is equal to the demand. Remember, we said this was efficient in the case in the case of perfect competition. We wanted marginal cost to be equal to demand. Well, it's equal to, well, in this case it is. The thing is, this monopolist is going about it a different way. He's doing that by charging people different prices, and he's able to extract a bigger profit as a result of that. So, what is the basic outcome we get from or expect to get from a monopoly market? We expect to see higher prices than we would in perfect competition. We expect to see lower output, lower quantities than we'd expect to see in perfect competition. The monopolist may also be able to show economic profits in the long run. Remember, we said that in perfect competition, we do not expect the firm in perfect competition to show any kind of economic profits in the long run. That is not true under monopoly. And then another thing, another outcome that we might expect to see in monopoly that we wouldn't expect to see in perfect competition is if this monopolist discovers ways of making the product more efficient, they aren't necessarily going to share that with the consumer. In perfect competition, if you were a producer and you discovered a way of producing your product more efficiently, it could give you a cost advantage that you might pass a portion of that on to your consumer. You might say, look, I'm able to make more profit by lowering my price because my cost is cheaper than my competition's, and I'll get more competition, I'll get more market share that way. Well, because the monopolist is the only firm in the industry, they don't have to do that. So they could internalize any kind of benefit that they'd get from improvements in technology that make them more efficient. So that's basically monopoly. Couple more to go, and I'll post these as soon as I possibly can.